Welcome to Olympian Method, the show where we ask the big questions in philosophy.
And we try to answer them as best we can, but then we question our own answers.
But we need your help to provide the answers.
Please comment down below if you have any insights. We'd love to know what you think.
So that was a great last chapter we had, talking a little bit about the religious nature of things. And I had a follow-on question that I wanted to take this discussion in now for you, Sean, about the golden rule, right? So do unto others as would do unto yourself, right? So I guess I want to start by asking, why is the golden rule not enough to inform our reality? Why can't we just do as we would have everyone else do to us?
Well, because I think there's a big difference between what we want and what we need.
Ooh, can you elaborate on that?
And I think needs inform morality more than wants. And I think because wants, yes, absolutely. Because wants, I think, fit in more with desires. And as we've outlined in previous episode, desires are not always intrinsically morally virtuous.
Right.
Sometimes they're reflective of needs, sometimes they're not. But for example, let's say there's a masochist,
okay,
who enjoys pain for some reason. Mm-hmm. So they think, I really like giving pain to myself. If I'm going to follow the golden rule, then I give pain to others. But it's almost like, according to Sam Harris's definition of morality, like causing pain to others is like one of the primary reasonable rationales for determining an amoral action. Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard of the silver rule?
No, could you please enlighten me?
It's pretty popular in the Jewish community. And by the way, I'm not Jewish. I just know this from listening to a couple Jewish podcasters or podcasters who happen to be Jewish. That's not like
they only talk about Jewish things.
They're like, welcome to the Jewish hour. No, that's nothing like that. It's a silver rule, which is do not treat other people the way you would not want to be treated. It basically,
I think my head just kind of got wrapped around itself. Could you give me an example of that?
Okay, so it applies to things like pain. It actually is the complete opposite of the masochist, because the masochist is like a weird outlier that almost really exists in fiction. Like it's most people tend to be deterred by pain and fear, and et cetera, et cetera. So, for example, do not do unto others what you would not want done to yourself. You wouldn't want somebody to come up and just punch you in the face for no reason. So you shouldn't punch other people in the face for no reason, etc. You kind of almost have to imagine that pain being done to you as a sort of an incentive to not do it to other people.
Mm-hmm. So what informs what we do not want to do to ourselves? Because I think mostly we think about what our desires are in the positive sense, right? We know what we think we know, at least what we want to do. But where do we tap into in order to know what we don't want to happen to us, right?
Well, I think it takes two things. It takes experience. You have to have experienced some measure of pain in order to know what you want for yourself and what you don't want. Mm-hmm. Everyone's experienced hunger. We all know that everyone wants to eat. We all know what hunger feels like. So therefore, we know that's not something that I'd want other people to experience.
Sure. And obviously there's this very basic survival instinct that's built into that having nutrition is what helps ensure your survival, right?
Right. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive though, because I think you can choose to not enact pain on other people, which is the silver rule, but then you can choose to give positive aspects to other people. For example, I think I might have mentioned this during the Christmas last year. I was thinking, you know what, I really want Starbucks for myself, but I'm going to try doing something, and I'm going to try just giving it to other people first. So I paid for the car behind me in line. This kind of goes in the notion of gratitude. It's like, I'm giving to myself, but I'm also giving to the person behind me. I'm basically giving to others what I am giving to myself.
Right. So that gets into the notion of sacrifice, right? So
yes.
How do you calibrate what you were just saying for the notion of sacrificing might cause you pain, at least in the short term, but it might be better for either your own person, it might be better for you personally, or it might be better for society as a whole for you to sacrifice. So how do you factor that into this framework for morality?
I like that you keep bringing up sacrifice. I think it's probably one of the most important themes that we've ever touched on.
Right.
So thanks for incorporating it. Well, I'll give you an example of a sacrifice not to do. Don't spend your last dollar on somebody else's Starbucks.
So it's kind of like a hierarchy of needs. Make sure that you fulfilled certain needs, basic needs you have, before you start fulfilling needs of others and giving yourself fulfillment in the process.
Mm-hmm. And there's a saying fill up your cup before you fill up others' cups. If I have an empty cup and I'm trying to fill up yours, there's nothing's going to happen. We're both going to be thirsty.
Right. Or the thing that I think I mentioned in the last podcast about like in an airplane, when the masks descend, like make sure to secure your mask before helping others. Right.
So do unto others as you would have them do to you. And I think a way of actually flipping the script would be do to yourself what you do to yourself is what you do to others almost.
Okay. So
I'll unpack that for you.
Yeah, please do.
So if I take care of myself and I go to bed, brush my teeth, and I take care of my appearance, etc., and I'm around people, I am refreshed, I am energized, and I'm able to give people my highest level of consciousness that I can. Whereas if I don't take care of myself, I'm actually limiting their ability to reach their highest level of expression.
So it's like a very symbiotic element to it.
So I think that taps into what morality is really trying to achieve, which is a sort of a symbiosis or a mutually shared goal between individuals.
Right. But so now the challenge though is that do we actually have mutually shared goals once you start looking across a large enough cross section of humanity, right?
Right. Well, I think for the most part, to be fair, I think our desires are a fair point to start. We all have a need for an existence within the power structures of our hierarchy, serotonin, regulated sense of self, so to speak. But we also have the need to reproduce, or we have those sexual desires as well.
Right.
We have food desires as well. So
what
I'm trying to say is all those desires are mostly match up. Most people have those desires.
Here's my question for you though. I don't know if it would be a utopian society, but let's just say we could at least fulfill all those basic desires. Everyone on the planet was at least able to have food, clothing, and shelter or something like that, right?
You ready for another rat study?
Well, maybe. So, but my question is, I don't think that having those base needs fulfilled would end conflict and strife in the world. I think there would still be plenty of evil of humans inflicting it on each other.
Actually, you can almost argue that it would lead to more evil. Right.
So I think that it's great to start from that foundational like survival instinct type of things, but I think that the problem is that that only answers a cross section of the questions of morality. A lot of the questions we get into is more about how we treat each other in ways that go beyond those basic instincts, right? In terms of more of like a social type of order.
I've been toying with a hypothesis in my head. Can you tell me what you think about it?
Please.
It doesn't matter if you say it can be as simple as yay or nay, and we can move on from there. But
yeah,
I mean, what do you think about all of our societal structures are basically extensions of hedging against all possible negative outcomes that would affect our survival? Like basically almost all of reality is just an extension, creating another level of security against extermination, against our own demise, so to speak.
Yeah, it's kind of like something we were talking about before we actually hit record on the podcast, which was another way. It's like a very utilitarian way to think of morality is act in a way that would create the most, like give the most possibilities to the future in terms of like giving people options and not taking away their options. Because obviously one of the reasons why murder is seen as like such a highly bad or evil thing is because of the finality of you're taking away someone's future like to the largest extent possible, right?
Exactly. And I mean, there's so many, it's all gray. Like I said, we don't claim to have any overarching answer to all of this. We're just trying to unpack it. But, like self-defense, you could accidentally kill someone. Well, that's not murder, technically. Murder is a very specific form, but it's still homicide.
Right.
Homicide is just the killing of another human being. But like killing in self-defense, for example, is different than murder.
Right. Well, so I think one of the reasons, and this is in that same moral framework, is because someone else is in the act of taking away like your moral, like your options, that gives you more justification to act with the same level of force, right? Because of how reprehensible their behavior was.
So I have two things that I want to touch on. One has to do with the mob. One has to do with rats. So in the mob, if one mobster was sleeping with another mobster's wife, they would kill not the wife, but the man who was committing the adultery, because it was essentially betraying the fabric of trust within the organization. And I think we had actually briefly mentioned, ironically, that a lot of trust is based on keeping secrets. Particularly like in any structure. Like I tell you something, you don't tell other people, there's a mutual trust there because you might use that information against me. Particularly in like a mob is basically a small example of a political situation. They would see like, okay, you know, Bobby's sleeping with Joey's wife. You know, Joey might kill Bobby and then completely rat out our operation. We need to take care of Bobby to send a message. And in doing so, you actually encourage good moral behavior of being like, how do I say it? Of preserving the sanctity of the marriage, which is, you know, something that's completely outside the mob. But that's kind of just a small tangent. I wanted to get back to the rats. There was a study done where they actually gave a large colony of rats tons of room to grow, tons of food, basically all the needs they had.
Yeah, almost like a utopian society, right?
The rat utopia. And it grew and it grew. But once it got to a certain size relative to the square, the rats they stopped grooming, they stopped taking care of themselves, they started fighting, and eventually the entire colony just died out. It basically just languished into oblivion. And part of the problem was like there was no need for a social structure. Basically, the whole reason we have social structures is to acquire those basic needs. So when the needs are met, we stop relying on the social structure to meet those needs.
Yeah, it's like you're like a victim of your own success in some way, right?
Yeah.
So do you think our society is in danger of reaching a similar conclusion?
Well,
I mean, I know that there was like the downfall of Rome, which I feel like there's certain elements of like they were meeting a lot of basic needs, but there were certain other underlying problems, right?
Underlying problems. I mean, one of which was that, I mean, you had the infusion of Christianity, and you had, you know, that's a whole topic I don't really want to unpack right now because it has to deal with certain genders and whatnot.
Yeah, so maybe if you're amenable to it, I'd like to go back to the golden rule a little bit.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah. So I guess
it's a question to the rats. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Is it actually in everyone's best interest to just give them the Garden of Eden, basically?
And doesn't seem like it is.
Based on our biology and how the rest of life operates, I would say it's not. Well, and that's the obstacle is the way, Stoic philosophy. I mean, the only reason we stand upright is because gravity is pulling on us and causing us to grow a certain way. The only reason we are is because there's been a constant force or a constant stressor on us our entire lives. And that's just one example.
Right. So
gravity.
That gets to the point of, this is a very Stoic philosophy thing. If you're never tested, do you even know what your own potential is?
Right. So I think we were talking about this in between the last chapter, which is the omniscient observer hypothesis.
Oh yeah, exactly.
The O. Yeah, that's what I call it, but it's called something else.
Yeah, right. But so the whole point about this is that if there were a being that had, if a being had all wisdom, all knowledge, as well as all knowing, not necessarily all powerful, so it's related to the concept of God, but it's not exactly the same thing. But just if there was an all knowing observer, basically that becomes the standard for morality. So when you say something is good, you're saying that if someone had like all of the knowledge and they knew kind of everyone's thoughts and intentions, this would be what they would decide to do, sort of thing. So it's kind of related, right?
It is. And we obviously know that being challenged is a good way to grow. So obviously that entity would know that as well. I think the obstacle is the way the book actually outlines a parallel of an emperor who purposefully puts like a boulder in a creek,
right,
to encourage his people to figure out a way to solve the problem. And this is a moment of inspiration. Book of Job. Are you familiar with it?
I am.
Yeah, the telling of how like God will put all these challenges in front of you as a way of. It's framed as being testing your fealty to God and your faith in God. But I want to replace God. It's just replacing your faith in being. It's like that's reality can be that way. And if you choose to look at it as a nefarious force that's just trying to deceive you, as Descartes would say, it leads to the nihilism, and that leads to the evil acts being committed, where you're basically acting in a way that's countering not only to your own being, but the being of all life that's around you.
Right. So, and this kind of gets into the notion of, is there a moral objective truth that exists kind of independent of our own desires and wills for what we want to have realized in the world? Or is it all just relative to each person's wants and desires, right? And I think there's a middle ground that's kind of in between, which is kind of how I feel like what position I'm in right now, which is that there is an objective moral truth, but that due to the natural limitations that humans have, that we can only approach that knowledge, like we can only acquire it in part, but that we may never be able to fully know, or I mean, it's good to have the belief that you're going to get there, but we're basically on a path towards it, right?
Right. Well, I think philosophy is the pursuit of truth. But tell me, what do you think is the objective of truth? I'm curious.
Well, I guess let me try and unpack, because are you asking what's the source of the truth? Like, where can you know it? Or are you asking sort of like, there's a few different questions you could ask around the objective truth there, right? So one school of belief that's we've talked about in mostly the last chapter was that the dogmas of religion is that absolute truth. It's the word of God, maybe, right? And that dictates morality. Now, I think there's some, even if you subscribe to that, I think there's some danger to the fact that that was recorded by humans who are imperfect translators of God's word, right?
It almost sounds deceitful, right? Because it's like almost all humans who have been in a position of power know the full extent of how deceitful humans can be. So to claim that you're getting your information from a divine source of power is almost like knowingly saying, it's like knowingly saying, I am human, I am flawed, but I'm going to make people believe that I am a god, so that way I can get what I want.
Yeah, so maybe a better way of interpreting that or building up a religious system is that you should tap into the word of God, that you should basically, that God should communicate with you more directly and not through other humans, right?
And that's kind of the notion of truth. Have you ever heard of, metaphysical side note, have you ever heard of the letters to God?
Different from because I think C.S. Lewis wrote something like that, but I don't know if that's the one you're thinking of.
It might be. All I know is that an author just took pen and paper to Dear God letters, asking him questions, and he started kind of writing. It's called channeling, but he started writing what he imagined how God would answer. But the answers were more sophisticated than he believed his own ego or persona could articulate. And very insightful. And it almost kind of reminds me of the active imagination that Jung proposed. By the way, Jung was highly criticized as creating his own religion back in the early 20th century. Like a lot of scholars said was like, you're basically creating a cult, Jung. You're creating a psychological cult or a religious following. And he's like, no, I'm trying to unpack the psyche. So I like what you said, though, because what you said reminds me of him is going within to look for a sense of morality.
Yeah, and I feel like you kind of have to reach within in order for you to build a system that you're going to rely on and trust. And so we talked about like whether you use logic and reasoning to try and deduce what those rules should be, or if you rely on like religious experiences where you believe that you're tapping into some other like higher level of existence that is communicating with you what you should do, right? But I think both of those have different like limitations they come with, and there's probably a lot of overlap between the two. It's just how your brain is interpreting the process that you're going through when you're making the decisions, right?
The interpretive framework can that's another thing too. The very structure, the biological structures of our mind can determine whether or not we act out in ways that are considered immoral or not. I think there was a case of a guy who murdered his entire family, and he had written all of these letters saying, I don't feel right, like I feel like something's off. Like he basically felt himself going insane. It turned out he had a brain tumor that was suppressing a region of his brain, and the region itself regulated violent tendencies. So there's almost a case to be made that, back to the Asian way of interpreting good and evil of knowledge, if the structures like our minds, like our brains, are not able to house that information, then how can basically a person who's not knowing be good? And I'm trying to wrap it up here a bit. But that doesn't mean everyone who's intelligent is necessarily good either.
Right. Yeah. So I'm just trying to wrap up the topic since we're short on time here. But yeah. I think a good question there is there, do we give different credit or different credence to your actions based on your knowledge, right? Because you could do things that are like treated as good that could further the cause of humanity or things like that, but you may have ulterior motives. You may be thinking that you're doing them for your own personal benefit.
Doing it for the gram.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know if that's the best example of it, but let's just say that you are doing something selfishly in your mind, but maybe those actions happen to achieve good outcomes. So I think a lot of times we give less credit in terms of how good that is, because it seems like the intent does matter, not just the outcome.
But intent's also really hard to know. Back to knowing, it's really hard to know people's intent. We only know their actions.
Right.
So someone can do a really good thing, like say philanthropy, but maybe it's just to set up a situation where society views them as good and it makes them immune to any sort of, how do I call it? I don't want to use reprehensible, but we'll call it morally questionable activity that they do in the future. You know, it's like they're purposefully, that's almost like they're planning to set up hedging their bets against reprisal by choosing to do something that's good for selfish reasons.
Yeah. So I think we've unpacked a lot of different aspects to this. We've attacked morality from a couple different ways. I've tried giving you logical, we've looked at some different comparisons and contrasting between good and evil and even wrong and bad and those types of things. Yeah. I was wondering if you had any closing thoughts here.
Yeah. So we talked about the golden rule. Like, is the golden rule enough? Is the silver rule even enough?
Right.
And then the silver rule is don't treat other people the way you wouldn't want to be treated. Golden rule, do unto others as you would do unto yourself. I think it's a question of, you can only do good to other people insofar as you know how to be good to yourself. You can only be as good to other people as good as you are to yourself. I think that's the only real reasonable objective statement conclusion that I can come to, if there was one. What about you?
Yeah, I think it's hard to take a conclusion. I mean, obviously the main point I wanted to convey was just that unpacking this is a lot more complicated than people tend to think, because it seems like good and evil is just such a foundational thing. It's like, oh yeah, I know what's good, I know what's evil. And then you start looking at, well, why do I think that's good? Why do I think that's evil? And now you're starting to do philosophy, right? So that's the part we really want you to be engaging in right now. So please, leave comments about any of the stuff that you're interested in.
And read my mind again. I was just about to tell them to do that.
All right, you can do it.
Please do comment. We really do appreciate it. And reach out to us if you have any questions. We check the comments regularly. So looking forward to seeing you again, Olympians.
Yes.
Until next time, Wolf.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Later, Olympians.
Later, Olympians.